Hey everybody, welcome to Board Online, Board Offline. Today we're bringing you a how to play video for Middara. Now this is part 1 of 5. This is going to be the basics. It's probably going to be the longest out of the 5 videos, so be sure to come back and check on them as they are released. I'm going to be releasing them as we get closer to the supposed upcoming Kickstarter. There's going to be a new Kickstarter. Nobody knows exactly when it's coming, but at some point, probably this summer, a new Kickstarter for Middara is going to be coming out. So be sure to keep checking back, and I will be releasing more and more of these as we get closer. Again, this is part 1 of 5, so I'm really excited to bring this to you. It's been a lot of fun creating these how to play videos. Between Middara and Kingdom Death, I'm not sure which one has been more challenging. Both of them have extremely long rule sets, so pretty challenging, but also a lot of fun. So let's get right into it. This game has been amazing, and I have loved every minute I've played of this game. So it's been a while since a game just kind of showed up out of nowhere and really stuck in my brain like this one has. If you do want to support the channel, you can find various ways to do that in the description below, and you can also find where you can purchase these shirts and more like them from Mr. Meeple. That link is in the description as well. And now let's get right down the table and I'll show you how to play Middara. Middara is a game of unfolding narrative, and so can be spoiled if too much narrative is revealed. Throughout this video series, I'm going to inevitably have to show some spoilers while teaching the game. However, at most they will be minor spoilers, and they will all be contained in the first several missions, and I'm going to work very hard to use as few spoilers as possible. The way Middara is set up and played changes depending on the game mode the players decide to play. However, regardless of what game mode is chosen, Middara at its core is about completing encounters. In the crawl mode, players play through a chosen scenario with the end goal being specific to that chosen scenario. This mode is more similar to the more typical dungeon crawl board games. There is no emphasis on narrative in crawl mode, and its playtime is generally shorter. This could be the right mode if the players are looking to test the waters of Middara, so to speak, before investing the time into the adventure mode. In adventure mode, each player takes on the role of an adventurer in an elaborate story-driven game. Players progress through the story using the adventure book associated with that particular adventure. Encounters separate segments of adventures. Winning or losing encounters can change the overall outcome of the adventure as well as the direction players go during the adventure. Also, during adventures, players will be called upon to make decisions that will also change the flow of the adventure. This game mode is designed to be played 1 to 2 hours at a time, once a week or so with your game group over a lengthy period of time. Let's discuss crawl mode in more detail, and then we'll check out the adventure mode. There are 5 crawl mode scenarios included in Unintentional Malum Act 1, each with a different rank associated with it. To start crawl mode, players first choose the rank they want to attempt. In this case, rank 1 Cavern Fumigation eventually tells the players to continue to Sickle Bombing Expedition on page 10. Higher ranked scenarios will give adventurers an increased amount of gold and experience points to compensate for the difficulty of the enemies they will be facing. If this is the player's first time playing, it is recommended that they start with rank 1 scenario, Cave Sickle Extermination. As you can see, the first encounter in that scenario is Sickle Bombing Expedition. After choosing the scenario, the next thing players must do is to build 4 adventurers using the chosen scenario's gold and experience points. Players then use that gold and experience points to purchase disciplines and items in the shop and train phase. Unless otherwise noted, players may choose from all disciplines but are only allowed to buy items listed in the shop and train section of the setup here. We'll discuss the shop and train phase in more detail later in this video. Each scenario will be made up of different encounters that are played through in order to complete it. The scenario will direct players to an encounter setup diagram with directions on how to begin. We'll discuss how to set up an encounter in more detail shortly. Finally, the players begin playing that first encounter of the scenario. As players progress through each encounter, they will gain gold, items, and experience points through defeating opponents, looting treasure, completing achievements, and through other special encounter rules. Once the players complete an encounter, they will be given a variety of additional rewards. These will change based on where the encounter takes place within the scenario. Generally, players can expect their rewards to consist of some mixture of gold, experience points, the shop and train phase, and continuing on to the next encounter. Players win a scenario when they reach the end scene of that scenario. Typically, this is done by completing a certain number of encounters. If, however, players ever lose an encounter in crawl mode, they lose the scenario and everything they gained during the scenario is also lost. If players would like a more epic crawl mode experience, starting as a novice and growing their adventurer as a force to be reckoned with, they can try Epic Dungeon Crawl. This mode allows players to keep track of their progress between scenarios. To play an epic crawl, simply start with a rank 1 scenario and complete it, and then move on to the rank 2 scenario and continue on through rank 3, 4, and then 5. Players may never play a scenario of the same level or lower twice, and though perhaps ill-advised, it is allowed to skip ahead to a more challenging scenario if the players would like to. And that covers all the specific rules for the crawl mode that differ from the adventure mode. So now let's move on to the adventure mode itself. To begin playing the adventure mode, players choose an adventure to play. This game contains only one adventure titled Unintentional Malum Act 1. Eventually, adventure packs and other future content will contain a wider variety of adventures. To begin, players simply start on the first page of the adventure book. It's very important when playing adventure mode to not read ahead unless specifically instructed to do so. This book will guide players as they progress through the adventure. Scenes are sections of narrative read by the players between encounters. Every adventure starts with a scene. Scenes give context to the characters and the world the players are experiencing, as well as detailing the story of the adventurers. These scenes should be read aloud by the players so that everyone knows what is happening in the adventure. Also, Succubus Publishing will be releasing an app which will provide voice actor renditions of the scenes from the adventure book. Players may use this app instead of reading the book aloud.
Chapter 1. Before the Mast.
Let's take a closer look at exactly what players can expect to find in a scene in the adventure book. Players will find the name of the scene here, large chunks of text which are meant to be read aloud, and sometimes a scene will have an adventure mechanic such as this. So what exactly is an adventure mechanic? Well, occasionally while reading a scene, players will be asked to perform a task. In this case, make a Perception 10 check with Zeke. These adventure mechanics might take the form of skill checks, as you can see this one does. It might be gaining a new party member, adding story flags to the adventure sheet, or instructing players to continue to the next scene or encounter. In this case, Zeke will use his perception skill, which is 6, roll the appropriate dice, and try to make a total of 10. We'll discuss skill checks in detail during the skill checks portion of this video. Adventure mechanics will always be listed in a box so they are easily identified by players. They must always be completely resolved before proceeding further. As with crawl mode, players win an encounter in adventure mode when they reach a win condition. All win conditions will be listed in the encounter setup as you see here. Likewise, the players lose if they reach the lose condition. If the players ever lose an encounter, they read the hidden text under the lose condition of the encounter setup. The most common lose condition is for all party members to be defeated. Even in the case of a loss, the players will still keep all the rewards they have gained during the encounter, such as gold and items. We'll discuss more about the end conditions and rewards shortly, but just know, just because players lose an encounter does not mean they must repeat this encounter or that the game is over necessarily. Oftentimes, losing simply changes the path of the players or changes the rewards they'll be receiving, but the story continues. It's also important to realize that the adventure mode is not intended to be played in a single session the way the crawl mode can be played. As you can see, this book is quite large. Instead, it is intended to be played in 1 to 4 hour sessions over a long period of time. When stopping between encounters, players must keep track of many variables. There is one copy of the adventure sheet on page 72 of the rulebook, but players can also download additional copies for free at succubuspublishing.com. The adventure sheet is intended to keep track of most information between play sessions. Players can put the page of the adventure book they're currently on here, the amount of gold that the party has acquired, the amount of XP that each character has acquired, the amount of damage each character currently has, the name of each character, whether that character is injured or unselectable for any reason, any flags the party has acquired, and any achievements the party has acquired, and finally, any other notes necessary here. It's very important to update the adventure sheet at the end of every gaming session. Personally, I try to update it at the end of each encounter. Anytime a party member is unselectable, this party member cannot be chosen as part of the active group and may never trade items with other party members. However, when receiving rewards that are given to each party member, the unselectable members will still receive these rewards. If that adventure ever becomes selectable again, be sure to erase the checkmark from the unselectable box. Injuries are adventure mechanics that sometimes occur when an encounter is lost or when a skill check is failed or even when a poor decision is made. When an adventurer is injured, the player should mark this box next to their name on the adventure sheet. An adventurer will remain injured until an adventure mechanic says otherwise. While injured, an adventurer may no longer be chosen as part of the active group, but may exchange items when all party members can exchange items. As the adventure progresses, adventure mechanics will occasionally ask players to mark flags. These are meaningful events that happen during an adventure that can change the course of the game. Typically, flags will be added based on the player's performance during an encounter or after a decision has been made. Some encounters have achievements. These are special rewards players can gain by doing something extraordinary. If an achievement's condition is fulfilled, read the hidden text next to it. Each achievement may only be completed once, and only the adventurer who completed the achievement gains the reward unless otherwise specified. Once an achievement is completed, the players mark it off on their adventure sheet. Also, the game includes these adventurer tuck bags. These are used to store an adventurer's card items and disciplines in between game sessions, since those are not recorded on the adventure sheet. There's also an additional bag to use as the party stash to store items not currently equipped to any adventurer. At the beginning of Unintentional Malum Act 1, players will have access to these 4 heroes making up their party. At the beginning of most future adventures, players will always have access to at least 4 heroes making up those parties. However, as each adventure progresses, new adventurers may join the party and others may leave the party. However, at all times, players will have access to the entire party. Whenever players are instructed to, they must choose 4 adventurers from their party that form the active group. The active group is the set of adventurers the players are currently using during their encounter. Once the active group is selected, it can only be changed when instructed via adventure mechanics or special encounter rules. Most often this will occur during the story round, which we'll discuss more in a moment. Also, while not in an encounter, players may only exchange items during story rounds, or when specifically instructed to do so. When exchanging in this way, players may also exchange with the party bag. The only other time adventurers may trade is by making a re-equip action during an encounter. An adventurer may leave the party for any number of reasons, even death. When an adventurer does leave the party, the adventure book will specify what to do with all of their items and disciplines. A story round is a special adventure mechanic that typically occurs when adventurers narratively have a bit of free time. During these times, players will be able to buy new items, upgrades, and disciplines. Players will also be able to embark on side quests from story rounds. Story rounds are conducted in 3 phases in the following order. Shop and Train is the first phase. During the Shop and Train phase, players will create a store and spend their gold to buy items and item upgrades. Players may also sell items if they wish for gold. However, several types of items may not be sold by the player. These item types are consumables, monster loot, and story items, which I don't have a story item to show you right now. Story items are cards that players may only acquire through adventure mechanics or special encounter rules. There are also story disciplines which are acquired in the same way. At the beginning of the game, all these cards are found in the hidden card decks. These cards should not be revealed until specifically instructed to do so. As previously mentioned, the story items may never be sold. Also, the story disciplines may never be purchased with experience points. So I already mentioned how players may use gold to purchase items. However, players may also, during the shop and train phase, spend experience points to learn new disciplines. To conduct the shop and train phase, players will need to first build the store. Before we move to the next phase of the story round, let's talk more about the store. The store is a group of item cards that adventurers are able to purchase during the shop and train phase of a story round, or anytime the players are directed to shop and train. When a player is directed to shop and train, she will be given a list of items and item upgrades that will be a part of the store, such as this one right here. Most stores contain one random unique item. If one is listed, then shuffle all the appropriate unique items, in this case all the mundane unique items, and then draw from the bottom. This unique item will now be part of the store for this entire shop and train phase. It's also very important to note that if a unique item is purchased, nothing replaces it in the store. New unique items will not be available until a new store is built during the next named story round. In other words, if the players find themselves in the same named story round several different times, they will not redraw a unique item. In this case, the story round is named the City of Alenia, so every time the players come back to the City of Alenia, this is the unique item waiting for them, unless it's been purchased, in which case there are no unique items at the City of Alenia. It's also important to realize that that unique item is now in the store and will not be available during an encounter. After the shop and train phase of a story round, the next phase is the explore phase. During this phase, players may select from a list of optional side quests. A side quest may only be attempted one time, regardless of if the players successfully complete it or if they fail. Once a side quest is completed, it usually will return the players back to the same named story round and allow them to go through all the phases once again. Remember a moment ago when I mentioned returning to the same named story round multiple times? This is how that can happen. Bounties are special types of side quests that may be attempted once in each named story round in which they appear. A bounty is a set of encounters that, like all side quests, may only be attempted during the explore phase. Regardless of how many bounties are available, only one may be attempted per named story round. Story rounds will also specify which difficulty of bounty may be attempted, and the players may only attempt that specific difficulty, not more and not less. Unintentional Malum Act 1 comes with this one bounty, the Blighted Terror. It has a difficulty of 2, which is considered an intermediate bounty. Heroes are recommended to be equipped with at least common items for this bounty. For an easy bounty, with 1 skull, mundane items are recommended, and for a hard bounty, uncommon items are recommended. That would be 3 skulls. As you can see, for this story round, a 1 skull bounty is the only bounty that can be attempted, and so right now, with the base game, there is no bounty available to you when you're in this story round. If a player does attempt a bounty, it follows all the same setup rules as you're learning for the regular encounters. Once a bounty has been successfully completed, adventurers may not complete it again. But unlike normal side quests, if a bounty is failed, the players may attempt it again during the next named story round with the appropriate difficulty level. Once players have attempted all side quests, or if they simply choose not to attempt a side quest, they proceed to the Venture 4th phase. When players move into the Venture 4th phase, they will be given instructions on what to do next, and as a group, they choose. Unintentional Malum Act 1 and all future adventures will contain multiple endings, which are special scenes that end the current adventure players are playing. Most ending scenes will result in a game over. When this occurs, the players may simply try again, or if they'd rather, they may start the adventure over from the very beginning. Up to this point, we've discussed both the crawl mode and the adventure mode. Regardless of which mode players choose, however, they will be instructed to set up encounters. Let's take a look at exactly what information players will find on an encounter page. The name of the encounter is at the very top, along with its type symbol. The 3 location types are underground, wilderness, and dungeon. Currently, these are just for flavor and have no mechanical use. Here, players will find a short narrative about the encounter. The north arrow is always available to assist in the board's orientation. On the map, players will find the starting zone for the adventurers. The starting zone is on a visual representation of the tile layout, along with any tokens and combatants. Players will always find a written itemized list of all the components necessary to set up the encounter. And if a scene or encounter continues past the page it's currently on, the word continued with an arrow will be at the bottom of the page. If the encounter does continue like that, the name of the encounter will be at the top of the next page as well, with the word continued next to it. The end conditions are listed here, both win and lose. Any special encounter rules will be listed. These are rules specific to this particular encounter. Generally, they will change how an encounter plays. The results of triggering a totem are usually hidden and require the red decoder. The same is true for loot tokens, as well as any objective tokens. The loot level for this particular encounter is printed here. We'll discuss more about loot levels in just a moment. And there will be useful tips printed throughout the Middara adventure book. Be sure to read them. They're not just there for flavor and can actually provide some very useful information. When setting up an encounter, first be sure to read the special rules for that encounter, as sometimes they may affect the setup, and then go through the 4 phases of setup in order as follows. First is the prepare phase. Each adventurer during the prepare phase will remove any used tokens from their once per encounter abilities. If an adventurer was defeated in the previous encounter, or if she has more than half of her maximum health in damage, then remove damage tokens until she has damage equal to half of her maximum health points. If the adventurer had any effect tokens such as poison, all effect tokens would be removed. And then all adventurers set their stamina points to their stamina point recovery value indicated by these red dots, which usually is 3. It's important to note that if the adventurer had any ability tokens, they would not be removed at this point. If you're ever unsure about what is an effect versus what is an ability, page 74 of the rulebook has a good guide on negative effects, positive effects, and ability tokens. Also, as a general rule, you can remember that effects are square tokens, whereas abilities are circular tokens. Next is the placement phase. During this phase, players will set up the tiles according to the encounter setup diagram. One of the easiest ways to determine the appropriate orientation for the tiles is to look for its individualized letter and number series. In this case, this one is UM15, and compare it to where that shows up on the tile in the book. Once players have placed out the tiles according to the encounter setup diagram, they then place all encounter tokens. In this case, a blue exit here and a blue totem here. The players place terrain tokens out, in this case, 2 long obstructions, and players may place their figures in any of the spaces marked as the starting zone. The third phase of setup is the distribution phase. In this phase, players will distribute the listed combatant cards amongst themselves. This may be done in any order or by any method. However, making sure that combatant cards are evenly distributed makes sure each player has a responsibility when it's not her turn. In this case, there is only 1 combatant card at the beginning of the encounter, but oftentimes there will be more than 1. The fourth and final phase of the encounter setup is the initiative phase. Players take the initiative cards for each adventurer and combatant in the encounter and shuffle them together. They are then dealt out to form the initiative track. And now you're ready to play. Players will now read the introduction for the encounter and then begin working their way through the initiative track, and will continue working their way through the initiative track over and over until the end condition for the encounter is met. In Middara, encounters can be wildly different. As you've already seen, each encounter contains a unique setup and diagram. Let's talk in a little bit more detail about navigating and using an encounter. Any gridded area is considered a space, and spaces that share a corner or edge to a space with a figure are adjacent to that figure. Red borders, however, block line of sight and adjacency. Areas that do not contain a grid, such as these, are not considered spaces, and they cannot be moved into and are never considered adjacent. Other than the red border, other colored borders are indicative of terrain effects and may affect line of sight depending on what that terrain effect is, but do not affect adjacency. So for instance, Nightingale is adjacent to this blue loot token, but is not adjacent to this blue totem because of this red border. Text is often hidden during encounters to keep information from players until it is revealed at the appropriate time. When it's time to read the text, the player uses the included red decoder to reveal it. It's important that players never read hidden text until told to do so. Every encounter has one or more end conditions. Once one of these is reached, the encounter ends immediately, and the players then read the listed reward beneath the end condition that was met. It's important to realize that end conditions are not optional and happen the moment the stipulations are met. For instance, in this case, it says, an adventurer ends their turn on the blue exit, which means that if Remy, for instance, were to end her turn on the blue exit, then at that point, the encounter would end regardless of if the other players had things they wanted to accomplish first. Sometimes an adventure will have multiple win or lose conditions. Regardless of how many win or lose conditions are available, only a single end condition may ever be met during an encounter. The listed encounter rewards are gained immediately, after which the adventure continues. It's important to completely read all rewards before beginning the cleanup of the encounter. Some rewards might reveal new surprises, such as continuing the current encounter. Totems represent the unknown. Each totem in an encounter will immediately activate the moment an adventurer draws line of sight to it. So, how exactly is line of sight drawn in Middara anyway? Well, line of sight is not affected by range, and so it can be drawn across the entire board if necessary. This means with some of the larger encounters, players should be constantly checking totems to make sure no adventurer has drawn line of sight to it yet. Line of sight is drawn from the center of a figure's space to the center of whatever space the figure is trying to see. Obstructing terrain does block line of sight, so in this case, Rook cannot see the totem. If he was here, he still cannot see the totem because that line would be drawn again through obstructing terrain. However, once Rook moves here, or even here, now he can see the totem and the totem would activate. Now that the totem is activated, the player would read the text for that totem. Once that text is resolved, this totem is discarded. At this point, the player who activated the totem continues her turn unless otherwise instructed by some effect of the totem. During setup, players will usually be instructed on which specific totem colors to place out, but sometimes the encounter will instruct players to use a random totem. Random totems are shown in white in the encounter diagram. In these cases, all available totem colors are placed face down and then chosen at random so that no player knows what color that totem is. Players activate loot tokens by taking an encounter action while standing either adjacent to or while occupying the same space that the loot token is on. When a player activates a loot token, they read the corresponding text, and after resolving the hidden text, the player continues their turn unless otherwise instructed. As with the totems, during setup, specific loot tokens are placed face up. Sometimes, however, the encounter will show a white loot token, which indicates a random color is to be used. In these cases, the available tokens are placed face down and chosen at random so the players won't know the color until it's activated. In the loot section of an encounter, players will find the loot level listed. The loot level determines how the combat loot deck will be set up during an encounter. On page 20 of the rulebook, players will find this diagram which details how the loot deck should be set up depending on the loot level. If the player is instructed to gain an item type, such as a consumable, during an encounter, the loot level refers to the tier of the item gained. So for instance, if the player was instructed to gain a random consumable and the loot level was mundane, she would shuffle all the mundane consumables and then draw one from the bottom and gain that item. It's also important to note that the loot level refers to that loot level and all loot levels below it. So if the player is instructed to gain a random consumable, she would actually shuffle all the common consumables together with the mundane consumables and then draw one at random. The loot level also reflects the tier of item gained from the unique loot card and the item loot card found in the loot deck. We'll discuss the specifics of loot cards, including the monster loot card, in the combatants video later in this series. Items are always gained by the adventurer that activated the loot token or defeated the opponent that provided the item. Also, remember to discard the loot token once it's been activated. If it is not explicitly clear who gained the item, or if the party gains an item, then the players decide together who specifically will gain this item. If an adventurer has no room for the item they gain, they may either discard the gained item or discard an item in their pack, or move the item to the party stash. Objective tokens represent a variety of different things found in encounters. These tokens can be very different from each other, both mechanically and thematically. The encounter diagram will specifically indicate when and how objective tokens activate. It is vitally important before taking the first turn of encounter that all players should understand exactly how each objective token in that encounter activates. Occasionally, no instructions for activating an objective will be initially given. If this is the case, it may be referenced in hidden text of another token. When conditions for activating the objective token are met, players must immediately activate the objective token. As with other tokens, the players read the corresponding text listed under that objective, and once the objective is resolved, the player continues her turn unless otherwise indicated. Often, as an in-condition reward, and occasionally other times as well, players will be instructed to restore adventurers. Narratively, this represents downtime where the adventurers can rest. To restore adventurers, the players first remove all damage tokens. Next, they unexhaust and unflip all item cards. And finally, remove all effect and ability tokens. It's very important to realize that unless specifically told to restore, players will not remove all damage tokens or unflip any cards in between encounters. In other words, if the players run from the start of the initiative track all the way to the end of the initiative track, and none of the Waterloa's conditions were true, and no other enemy was spawned during that round, then an urgency token will be added to the end of the track. Any passive abilities an opponent may use do not count as a true condition for these purposes. We'll discuss these AI steps in much more detail during the combatants video of this series. If ever a fourth urgency token is added to the end of the initiative track, all adventurers are immediately defeated. All urgency tokens, however, are removed always at the end of an encounter. Sometimes a special encounter rule or an adventure mechanic will instruct players to reveal hidden cards. These come in three sizes: small, medium, and large. When instructed to find a hidden card, players will search through the appropriate deck by viewing only the top left corner of those cards. This will help prevent spoiling what some of the other cards are. Once the card is located, the special encounter rule or the adventure mechanic will then instruct players what to do with that card. As previously mentioned, do not reveal any hidden cards unless instructed to do so. Exit tokens represent the way out of the encounter. The encounter will list exactly how the exit token will be used, but generally when an adventurer ends her turn on the exit token, that will end the encounter. Terrain tokens are used to place different types of terrain on the tiles. These tokens can be moved on and interacted with by adventurers the same as if the terrain were printed directly on the tile itself. We'll cover the various terrain a little later in this video. Any token placed on the map other than obstructing terrain can be moved onto and through. Circular tokens never block line of sight and can occupy the same space as figures or other circular tokens. Also, they can occupy the same space as terrain tokens. On occasion, encounters will instruct players to reference a diagram to reveal special hidden information or determine how things spawn. When this occurs, the player will consult the indicated diagram in this diagram book. If players wish, there's probably not much harm in flipping through this book, since the diagrams are only listed by their number, and there's no indication which scenario or encounter they belong to. Encounters will often instruct players to spawn figures or other game components. When instructed to spawn any component, the player simply places the component in the indicated space. Combatants are the most common type of components players will be instructed to spawn. If the new combatant's initiative card is not already in the initiative track, the current player rolls the black die. For each shield rolled, in this case 2, move the combatant an additional space down the initiative track. So let's say that this was Zeke's turn. Normally, the combatant would go here, but 2 shields were rolled, so that's 2 spaces. And so the combatant would slip in right here. If the skull was rolled, then the initiative card would have gone immediately after Zeke. The same is true if the 4 books are rolled. If a die roll would ever have the initiative card be added beyond the end of the initiative track, it is simply added at the end of the initiative track. It does not wrap around back to the front and continue back down the track. If ever multiple initiative cards will be added to the initiative track, players will roll the die once for the first one, once for the next one, and so on. If a combatant is ever spawned outside of a player's turn, then with the 4 books or the skull, the initiative card will be placed at the very beginning of the initiative track. And then for each shield rolled, it would be moved 1 space down. If an encounter ever provided multiple spaces on which a component could be spawned, the players get to choose which space it goes on. If the space a figure should be spawned on is ever occupied by another figure, it will instead be spawned on the nearest adjacent space. If the players are instructed to discard something or remove it from the board, it should be set aside for possible future use later in the same encounter. If, on the other hand, they were instructed to remove something from the game, it will be put back in the game box and will no longer be used for this encounter. It's important to note this only applies to the current encounter. On the other hand, if a component is permanently removed from the game, it will no longer be used for the remainder of the entire adventure. Now let's talk a bit about terrain. There are 7 types of terrain in Middara. The most common is normal terrain, which has no special effects. Hindering terrain, indicated by this green border and this symbol, causes attacks made through it or into it to get -1 to the attack roll. This effect is only applied once regardless of how much hindering terrain an attack is passing through. It costs 2 movement to leave a hindering terrain space. An ability that places hindering terrain can only replace normal terrain. Water terrain is indicated by this blue dashed line and this symbol. Figures in water terrain may not dodge. It costs 2 movement to leave a water space. Abilities that place water terrain may replace normal terrain, hindering terrain, and muck terrain. Placed water terrain never has a current, and we'll discuss current a bit more later. Muck terrain is indicated by this brownish border and this symbol. Muck terrain causes figures to spend an additional stamina point on all actions and abilities that cost 1 or more stamina points to use. Abilities that place muck may replace normal terrain and hindering terrain. Dangerous terrain, indicated by this border and this symbol, can cause a figure to be immediately defeated. Any figure that ends its turn in dangerous terrain, ends its movement in dangerous terrain, or leaves a dangerous terrain space is immediately defeated. If a token is ever somehow moved into a dangerous terrain space, it is immediately discarded. Abilities that place dangerous terrain can replace any type of terrain except obstructing. Obstructing terrain, indicated by this red border, blocks all line of sight. Obstructing terrain is not considered a space, and figures cannot move onto it or through it. No effects ignore obstructing terrain other than unstoppable. Abilities that place obstructing terrain can replace all types of terrain except for dangerous terrain. An elevation change on the game board is indicated by this dashed purple line and this elevation box, which includes an elevation number. Figures cannot draw a line of sight to figures on a higher elevation unless the target is on the edge of the higher elevation. So here, there's no line of sight. However, here, there is. Likewise, for figures on a higher elevation to draw a line of sight to lower elevation, they must also be on the edge. So right now, there's no line of sight, and now there is. However, figures on a higher elevation do have a benefit. They are now able to draw a line of sight through enemies and do not incur a penalty when drawing line of sight through allies or hindering terrain. There are 4 levels of elevation, with 1 being the lowest and 4 being the highest. Figures may move between elevation changes of 1 without penalty. For elevation changes of 2, figures may move down without penalty, but may not move back up at all. For an elevation change of 3, a figure may not move up, and if a figure ever moves down, he's immediately defeated. Figures using a flight ability are unaffected by elevation. Melee or break attacks may not target a figure at an elevation change of 2 or more. However, a ranged attack may be made at any elevation as long as there's line of sight to the target. Flanking bonuses may not be granted to figures on a different elevation than the target. I mentioned earlier that water terrain tokens can never have a current. However, sometimes tiles will have certain terrain that does. In these cases, the encounter setup diagram will always indicate which direction the current is flowing, as you can see here. Any figure that ends its turn in the terrain with the current will move the amount of spaces specified in the special encounter rules and in the specified direction. Figures will not move around other figures or around obstructing terrain, and instead, if the figure cannot move, as you see here, for any reason, then the figure is dealt irreducible damage equal to the spaces it will not be able to move. This even includes if a current pushes a figure to the encounter's edge. Loot tokens are also affected by current and move at the beginning of each round. Now let's talk about skill checks. Special encounter rules and adventure mechanics will sometimes require adventurers or combatants to make skill checks. These skill checks represent various non-combat challenges the players may be faced with. Depending on whether the figure is an adventurer or a combatant, the rules for making skill checks are different. Skill checks might require a specific figure, multiple figures, or a random figure to pass them. Whether the check is passed or failed, the instructions will tell the player how to proceed next. When an adventurer makes a skill check, the player rolls 2 purple dice and adds the appropriate skill value from the adventurer's card. If the total is equal to or greater than the listed skill check value, she passes. So in this case, if Zeke needed to pass a lore test of 10, then 2 plus 10 is 12, and he's passed. Combatants, loyal espers, and conduits all may need to make skill checks at some point during the game as well. However, they do not have printed skill values like adventurers do, and because of this, they instead will roll a black die when making a skill check. Any result other than the skull is considered a success, with the skull being the only result that causes a failure. During an adventurer's movement, they may choose to jump over spaces which they would otherwise prefer not to move through. Jumping is defined as moving over 1 or more spaces without being affected by the terrain's effects, such as reduced movement, being defeated, etc. Jumping may only be done during a move action or during free movement, and for each space jumped, one movement point is used the same as if the figure was moving through normal spaces. In order to jump, first the player declares she is jumping. Then she declares which space she's jumping to. So in this case, the player controlling Zeke may say she's jumping from here to here. The space being jumped out of must be unoccupied normal space, as you can see here. The space or spaces being jumped over cannot be occupied by another figure. The space being jumped into can be any terrain type other than obstructing terrain, but it cannot be occupied by another figure. Once the target space has been determined, the player then makes an Agility 10 skill check if jumping over a single space. For each additional space beyond the first that the adventurer is jumping over, the player must add 2 to the difficulty of the skill check. So if Zeke were just jumping to here, that would be a skill check of 10 agility. So if Zeke were just jumping here, that would be an Agility 10 skill check, but since he's jumping here, it will be an Agility 12. Zeke rolls the 2 purple dice and gets exactly 12. So he succeeds. If one or more allies is adjacent to the space the adventurer is jumping out of, then the jumping adventurer may add one of those allies' strength stats to her skill check. In this case, both Nightingale and Rook are adjacent to Zeke. Nightingale's strength skill is 2, but Rook's strength skill is 6, making Zeke's skill check automatically a 10, and therefore an automatic success if he was just jumping to here. But Zeke will need to roll at least a 2 to successfully jump all the way to here. And he did. If an adventurer fails the skill check and an ally is adjacent to the space he's jumping into, if an adventurer fails a skill check when jumping and an ally is adjacent to the space she's jumping into, the ally may attempt to catch the jumping adventurer by making a perception skill check with a difficulty equal to the agility check that was just failed. Rumi's perception is 3, which means she'll need to roll a 9 to catch Zeke. And as you can see, she did. If the jump fails, the adventurer lands on the first space he attempted to jump over, and his movement ends. For the rest of his turn, he may not take normal movement nor free movement. Also, it's important to note that if any part of the failed jump crossed over dangerous terrain, then the adventurer is defeated. If the jump succeeds, place the adventurer on the intended space and then continue with movement. Companions represent characters in the story that help out players in the adventure mode. These most commonly will be found in the hidden card decks. Companions do not count towards an adventurer's item limits, but an adventurer may only have one companion equipped. An adventurer may not store companions in their pack, but they may be stored in the party stash, which thematically just means the companion is doing their own thing. If the players are instructed to spawn a figure or token, but all copies are already in play, then they do not spawn anything. Items and disciplines are also limited by the components included in the box. No value, including attack rolls, damage, range, or any other number, may ever be reduced below 0. If a number would be reduced below 0 for any reason, its value is instead considered 0. When a figure, whether combatant or adventurer, gains damage tokens equal to their maximum health points, they are defeated and removed from the board. A figure may never have damage tokens more than their maximum health points. It's also important that an adventurer and allied combatants do not remove damage tokens once defeated, as they will return to play during the setup of the next encounter. As previously mentioned, during setup, if players have not been instructed to restore their adventurers, then all defeated adventurers and adventurers with damage equal to more than half their health will remove damage until the damage remaining equals half of their total health points. Throughout the game, different effects will refer to allies and opponents. An opponent is defined throughout the game as any figure with an opposing goal, while an ally is any figure that shares the same goal and therefore has no reason to hinder the completion of that goal. Anytime the term ally or allies is used for an action or an ability, it also refers to the figure that is using the action or ability, unless it specifically indicates other or another. So for instance, the magic bomb states, remove an effect from an ally within sphere of influence. Whereas Nightingale's ability says all other allies gain +1 stamina point, Nightingale gains +2 stamina points. Since this says all other allies, then that 1 stamina point must go to everyone except for Nightingale. Figures may have or gain immunities to effects, in which case that figure may not gain the effect it is immune to. So if Rook were to gain immunity to Wilt, and then an effect would try to apply Wilt to him, he would not gain the effect of Wilt. If a figure gains immunity to an effect it already has, then it will immediately lose that effect. Figures may also have resistances to different types of damage. When a figure with resistance to a particular damage type is attacked by that damage type, that figure reduces the final damage dealt to them by half, rounded up. We'll discuss attacking and damage and all the steps for attacking in the Adventurer's Turn video of this series, but just know for now that if Rook were resistant to physical damage, and he took 5 physical damage, that would be divided by 2, which is 2.5, rounded up, and so he would take 3 physical damage instead. Sometimes figures may have protection against spells. When casting a spell against a figure with protection, the target adds a black die to their conviction check. All books rolled in this way add +1 to the conviction check. The shields and the skull have no effect when rolling for protection. We'll discuss conviction checks in more detail and casting spells in more detail in the Adventurer's Turn video of this series. Abraxis Battle Dice is a minigame that players can take part in during the adventure mode. To play, players will need the Abraxis cards, damage tokens, stamina tokens, and the dice. Each adventurer gets 4 dice. One gets white and purple, one gets green and red, one gets teal and orange, and one gets blue and gray. Each player also starts with 10 Abraxis points represented by damage tokens and 5 fate tokens represented by stamina point tokens. When the players are able to play Abraxis Battle Dice, the adventure book will also instruct players on which Abraxis card to use. On the Abraxis card, players will find the name of the card, special rules that augment the Abraxis rules, and the card symbols the players are trying to match. Abraxis Battle Dice takes place through a series of 5 rounds. In each round, players will roll their dice in an effort to have the symbols on all 4 of their dice match the symbols printed at the bottom of the Abraxis card they are facing as closely as possible. At the end of each round, if the adventurer fails to match the symbols on the Abraxis card, they lose Abraxis points. Once an adventurer loses all of her points, she is out of the game. On the other hand, if any adventurer manages to survive 5 rounds, they will be rewarded. Each round, players simultaneously roll all 4 of their dice, and then must choose 1 die to lock in. When dice are locked in, this means that the adventurer is satisfied with the result of that die and has set it aside to be tallied against the card's symbols at the end of the round. Once a die is locked in, it may not be rolled again. An adventurer may lock in more than 1 die if she wants, at the cost of 1 fate token per additional die. Similarly, an adventurer may choose to not lock in any dice, also at the cost of 1 fate token. Once all adventurers have made their decisions on which dice to lock in and which to not lock in, they will repeat the process by rolling all of the remaining non-locked dice. This process will continue until at least 1 adventurer locks in her 4th die. Once at least 1 adventurer has locked in all 4 of her dice, the remaining adventurers have 1 more roll and then must lock in all the remaining dice. No fate tokens may be spent on this final roll. Now that all adventurers have locked in all 4 dice, they will each compare the symbols on the dice they've locked in to the symbols printed on the bottom of the Abraxis card. Also with the pit boss, you can see that his special ability is each round, draw a rare weapon and add its symbols to the pit boss. If no one gets an exact match, everyone loses 1 Abraxis point. Now obviously this would have been drawn at the beginning of the round, but we'll go ahead and put it out now for symbol comparison purposes. For each extra symbol on her dice and for each missing symbol on her dice, that adventurer will lose 1 Abraxis point. Also, if a player manages to match exactly the symbols that she needs, she will gain 1 Abraxis point. Once the compare symbol step is resolved, the round ends and the next round begins until 5 rounds have been completed with players repeating the steps we just went through. At the end of the 5th round, assuming any adventurers make it that far, rewards will be gained based on how many adventurers are still in the game. The adventure book will detail exactly what those rewards are. So there you go, there's the first part in our series of how to play Middara. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel, click the bell to get all the notifications for when the next 4 parts come out. And until next time, if you're bored online, bored offline.